Welcome, welcome, welcome. Two more welcomes. Welcome and welcome to everybody out there. Part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, columnists, writers, activists, professors, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, as long as they can form coherent thoughts. We want to provide them unedited and unaltered directly to you so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school. It was called thinking for yourself. Maybe we'll have a renaissance. Maybe we won't. With us today, it's our privilege to have Professor Claire Wardle, PhD. She's a professor of the practice of health services, policy, and practice at the Brown University School of Public Health. She's also the co-director of the Information Futures Lab, Department of Health Services, Policy, and Practice. I met her through recommendation from Professor Sloman. Professor Wardle is a co-founder and co-director of the Information Futures Lab and professor of the practice at Brown School of Public Health. She is considered a leader in the field of misinformation, verification, and user-generated content, co-authoring the foundational report, Information Disorder, an interdisciplinary framework for research and policy for the Council of Europe. Very prestigious. In 2015, Claire co-founded the nonprofit First Draft, a pioneer in innovation, research, and practice in the field of misinformation. Over the past decade, she has developed an organization-wide training program for the BBC on eyewitness media, verification and misinformation, led social media policy at the UNHCR, been a fellow at the Shorenstein Center for Media Politics and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, very prestigious, and been the research director at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia, also prestigious at University's Graduate School of Journalism. She holds a PhD in communication from the University of Pennsylvania. She's been a lecturer in the School of Journalism at Cardiff University. She's also lectured at Columbia University. She was a research fellow at Harvard University. She was also a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania and a lecturer at Cornell University. She's been a full-time consultant to the BBC, head of the social media at UNHCR, research fellow for TED Talks, executive director, co-founder of First Draft, and consultant to the CDC's Vaccine Insights Unit. Other institutions, World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the Future of Information and Entertainment. That's super prestigious. European Commission High-Level Expert Group on Fake News. Partnership on AI Media Steering Committee, BBC's Trusted News, Center for Strategic and International Studies, London School of Health and Tropical Medicine, high-level panel on vaccine confidence and misinformation, University of Washington Misinformation Escape Room Initiative, and the WHO's 5th Infodemic Management Conference. So a lot of research, a lot of teaching on different issues. Some of the other papers she's done is on the Unabomber versus the nail bomber, the press's agents of nationalism and the Queen's Golden Jubilee, monsters versus angels, visual press coverage of child murders in the U.S. So a lot of social issues, but a lot of expertise in health and the politics of health. And that's how I found the professor from Stephen Sloman, and that's going to be the focus of today's interview. Professor, before we get started, did I say anything wrong? Is there something I need to correct about your background?
No, you just showed that I've done a lot.
You've done a lot. You've done a lot. There it is. You can look up the professor more. I didn't have a particular research study to focus this interview on, which is atypical. That's how I usually do it. But Professor Sloman spoke so highly of you. I was wondering, just a general overview. Is there political polarization in the health field in the way patients are making health decisions? Have you seen evidence of that, or have you seen the total opposite of what Professor Sloman was saying?
No, it's exactly as Professor Sloman was talking about, which is, we know that in the US, polarization has just become more and more extreme. As somebody once explained to me when I moved here for graduate school, in 1999, they said, imagine it's like a football field and everybody used to be from both parties around the center line. Now they're on either side of the goalpost. And that person said that in 1999. We are so far off the field on either side of the goalposts. And you see this now from like the Pew Center does surveys, which is like, how likely is an American who identifies themselves as Democrat okay with their son or daughter marrying somebody who identifies from the other party. And you see this over the last 30 years decline significantly. And that's on both sides. So we've got this problem in the US, but also in my own country, in the UK and other countries. We see polarization rising in places like Brazil and Argentina. I mean, this is not just a US phenomenon. But what we see is not just, oh, people have differences, but like people actually think there's a kind of a growing hatred about people who are different. And that's what's so worrying. It's not just, oh, interesting, you come from a different perspective than me, let's have an interesting discussion. It's, I don't actually respect you, I'm not actually listening to what you say, and I don't want your children marrying my children. I mean, it's a level that's kind of extraordinary. So when you start there, the fact that people's health decisions are being shaped by that is what we need to understand, is that people's social norms are shaped by who their children go to school with, who they spend time with, who they choose to spend time with, like at the workplace, who they choose to spend time with when they go to the local bar. So we're increasingly, all of us, spending more time with people who are more like us. So when you spend time with people who are more like you, you say, oh, are you vaccinating your children? Oh, are you wearing a mask? Are you, what are you going to do about RSV? Or are you doing preventative screening for colon cancer? Those kind of discussions you're having with people you spend time with, you are less likely to have those discussions with your primary care provider, mostly because the number of Americans who now have access to a primary care provider is down to something like 43%. The majority of Americans don't have a primary care provider. So when you talk to me about health decisions, increasingly people are making health decisions via conversations with their friends and family and neighbors, who tend to increasingly be people who are like you politically. People are moving to neighborhoods where people are like you politically. You send your kids to schools, that we have fewer places where people are integrating. So that unfortunately leads to decisions around health being shaped by your nearest and dearest. And your nearest and dearest are more likely to have the same political views as you, which is why, unfortunately, health has become politicized.
I remember that when I was talking to Professor Sloman, that he seemed to be shocked that basically, as far as we have records, when people looked at medical decisions, they kind of looked at what options they had and what the different doctors told them. And that for the first time, at least my impression, what he was saying was it shifted to political conversations, like what you said. Hey, I've talked to some people, my friends, my colleagues, my coworkers, and they informed me, not a doctor, of what my best medical options are. And he goes, that's crazy, scary, and new. And it is my impression of the interview. Is this new? Has political polarization of medical decisions? It goes way back to the 1800s, if you think about this incident or this incident. Or is this new and scary?
I mean, let's just take vaccines. It's the most obvious example, but we've always had skepticism towards vaccines. We had it with smallpox. We've had 2 centuries of people asking questions about vaccines. And, I'm just going to say this now, that is a very healthy thing for all of us to do. We should be asking questions. We should be saying, well, how many people has this been tested on? The good thing about COVID vaccines is we've never had a vaccine that's been tested on this many people. So the numbers are really kind of extraordinary. But if we think about vaccines, people would be, they'd probably be at their local church saying, should I vaccinate my child? Like your social circle were people that you actually physically knew and you spent time with. Then telephones came around, but you probably weren't going to waste money on a telephone conversation about vaccinating your child. But the internet has allowed you to ask a question of anyone, and all of a sudden you find people who are likely to share your views. So, silly example, but like flat earthers, right? The reason that as a conspiracy took off was because previously, when I lived in my village in the middle of the UK, and I'd be like, hey, does anybody else think the earth is flat? They'd be like, no, Claire. And I would have nowhere to turn. I'd be like, okay, the earth is round. But on the internet, I could Google, is the earth flat? And some people would say, no, it's round. But all of a sudden, they'd be like, yeah, it is flat. And I'd go, are you sure? And they'd be like, yes. Welcome to our community. Tell us a little bit how so it's a community. So I would feel something because the flat earthers were bringing me in. So the same with vaccines now, just yesterday, I live in Rhode Island. I was on a Rhode Island local community group and somebody was like, I've just moved here. I'm not vaccinating my 2-year-old. I just want to check that's okay, right? And all these other mums were like, yep, haven't vaccinated my child. And there was probably 20 people that responded who said, I haven't vaccinated my child. I'm sure there was another 5,000 people that saw that post who have vaccinated their children, but they didn't say anything, right? So if you're just scrolling, the social norm looks like you don't vaccinate your children, because people who have were like, I'm not going to wade into this debate and I'm not going to say anything. So the other problem with the internet is it's warping our sense of what people actually think and what they're doing, because you end up hearing from certain types of people and you don't hear from others. So there's also that challenges of where you're getting your information from in a way that you can always connect with others, but it's not a good representative sense of what other people are thinking.
Sure. But I've heard no president was as horrible at handling a crisis as Donald Trump, and he did so much misinformation and attacked the health institutions and told people to take bleach that he caused so much confusion over what the right way to deal with COVID was. Have we had a similar level of polarization politically around health decisions to the level we saw with COVID ever before in American history?
I don't want to say ever before in American history, although I'm struggling to find a time. I mean, the lessons, I mean, the White House had it had guidebooks for how do you manage health crises, because there had been lessons learned from Ebola and SARS and other things. And it was very clear. President Obama was very clear. It was like, you never get a president, you never get a politician to be the spokesperson. You must always have the country's kind of top health expert. But President Trump didn't take that advice, and he decided that he was going to be the primary spokesperson. And that was the minute that politics intersected with health in a way that we hadn't had previously. So, you know, whatever you think of Donald Trump, what we should be critical of is the fact that he decided to be that spokesperson when, you know, he doesn't have a health background, he doesn't have a medical background. And by bringing politics into the pandemic, it politicized something that should not have been politicized.
What about when the World Health Organization and all of the doctors around the world said, oh my God, COVID, it could kill you. Hey, everybody, we need to stay away from each other. You need to practice distancing. You need to stay indoors. You need to not go outdoors. Okay. And then a man called George Floyd was murdered, and they showed the video on TV. And then the World Health Organization said the exact opposite. It's totally cool to go out there and protest BLM. It will somehow make you healthy. Does that help build trust with the public for the Hugh to totally contradict its information?
Yeah, there was, I mean, the many mistakes made during the pandemic, but huge communication mistakes. There's still a tweet up from the WHO from January 2020 that says COVID is not airborne, in capital letters, because that's what everybody thought in January. Instead, what people should have said is there's a new virus. We're currently investigating it. It could be airborne, or it could be, you know, It could move on, you know. Until we know, let's all take all the precautions, because we don't know. And as soon as we do, we will give you that information. But there should have been no categorical decisions on masks, whether or not you could be indoors or outdoors, whether or not you should be washing your fruit. None of this should have been categorical, because nobody knew at that point. Nobody knew. And by saying things categorically, each time people had to change their minds, trust was lost. And I use this analogy all the time, but if you look at how a fire chief talks at the beginning of a wildfire, they'll say, today the fire is here, tomorrow the fire could be there, or there. I can't tell you where the fire's going, but I can tell you that I'm going to give you the best information when I have it, because my job is to protect you, and to protect my family and my community and myself. You follow me and you trust me, and I'm going to give you every piece of information when I have it. But this is a changing situation. Imagine if we had communicated like that at the beginning of COVID. It would have been a completely different situation, which is science evolves. You know, look at everything we know about breast cancer now in comparison to 20 years ago. That's science. That's what makes science incredible. The idea that we would have known immediately what was causing the virus, how it was transmitted, whether or not you could transmit if you were asymptomatic. I mean, the other mistake we made was saying, get vaccinated so you don't get COVID. People got vaccinated, they got COVID, and we're like, you lied to me.
That was a lie.
You know, as opposed to, you will probably still get COVID, but you won't die. You won't be hospitalized.
Right.
How's that for a deal? Like, we just didn't,
they didn't say that.
There was no humility. And that was from the WHO, from governments around the world. And the damage that was done, it's going to take 30 to 50 years to unpick. the
Oh
damage.
my God, 30 to 50 years to undo the lack or destruction of
So I
trust.
would say for trust levels to get back to where they need to be around government institutions, it's
Wow.
going to take a very long time.
So it wasn't just Trump. There were other actors who made some big boo-boos, fair to say, with COVID-19, and collectively that really hurt trust.
Yeah.
Did we have a system in America like that before, where our health experts get it wrong, our health organizations get it wrong, and the president also gets it wrong, and everybody just seems to not be able to message correctly? Have we done this before in America? Because I'm a history buff, and my impression is no. No, we've never. But
I mean, I don't want to. Again, I don't want to be categorical in my communication unless I've done my research. But I think what we had never had such a serious situation that affected every single American.
Fair enough.
That was screwed up as badly. Like, I'm sure there was some local situation that was handled badly, but I think we'd never had anything at this scale that was handled as badly.
And I don't want to leave it out. Anthony Fauci told everybody not to wear masks. That got people killed. And then he came back later and said, well, you should wear masks. And then,
I mean, it was another fatal error. It should have been, we think masks work. We also are desperately concerned that we don't have enough supplies. No surprise, this virus caught us off guard. We don't have all the supplies for frontline workers. However, here's ways that you can create a mask using a scarf. Here's how you can do other things. Like, there was a way to be nuanced around this and to be honest, which is by being categorical, by saying you don't need to wear a mask. That wasn't true. They were trying to protect supplies to frontline workers, which was a good thing. But by doing that, they caused other huge unintended consequences. So, I mean, it's easy with 2020 hindsight to say, what on earth were they doing? But there's a number of those examples that unfortunately have caused too many people to turn away from institutions and to do what we started this podcast talking about, which is like, you turn to your friend to ask for their advice. You don't go to your local Department of Health. You don't go to the CDC website.
Right. And it's, I've heard this before, and I've heard it was an unprecedented thing, but we have had disasters before. We've had disasters in Europe and in Asia and in America and in Russia, and we've done this for at least 20 to 30 years. We've had FEMA. We've had guidebooks on how to do communications in disasters. We have professors who are dedicated to this. We have guidebooks, and I'm supposed to believe, I couldn't find the guidebook when COVID came around. Whoops, I guess I lost all the institutional knowledge. Garbage. I don't believe that at all. I'm not talking to you about that. I've heard that as the institutional response. We didn't know. And I'm like, because there's never been a massive federal emergency ever before in American history. You've never had studies on communication during a crisis before in Europe, in America, at the academic level. I know that's not true.
Yeah, the guidebooks say things like, keep it simple. The audience can only take one message. I think a lot of the guidebooks didn't recognize how do you communicate in a networked environment. Those guidebooks were written when we had 3 evening news shows and we had fewer, that it was a very different environment. And so I heard yesterday somebody ask a question of somebody of a Department of Health and said, why is nobody talking about the quality of air inside? Why have we not spent more money on improving school ventilation systems and other things? Why are we still obsessed with vaccines? And the person said, slightly off guard, oh, well, it's quite a complicated message to talk about air ventilation. And everyone's like, no, it's not. So I think there's this sense with communication, like, it's best to be definitive. People want certainty in a crisis. And that actually didn't work when we had a new virus and we had unsettled science. So I think actually we had guidebooks, but I don't think the guidebooks were ready to express how you do this in a networked environment and how do you do this around a virus that nobody has seen before. So those two things were the disaster area.
Fair enough. But I have also talked to some people who worked in emergency management, and they said it has been known for decades. Public trust, number one. They totally screwed that up. I mean, wow, did they screw that up? And I'm supposed to buy, they had no idea. Fauci never heard of the idea of public trust before. I mean, maybe.
Yeah, but if you believe that if people are scared, they're automatically going to trust the government, that's the problem. There wasn't enough people that recognized that you only earn trust. I think there was a sense of like, well, people are automatically going to trust us. If we tell them to get vaccinated, they'll just get vaccinated. Yeah. If I stand and do a presentation every day, then they're going to trust me if I stand behind the right podium. And that just is not how trust works in 2023.
Absolutely. Just seems like a pattern. We couldn't fix New Orleans, couldn't fix the hurricane after New Jersey, couldn't fix Flint, couldn't fix Palestine, couldn't fix COVID. It's just kind of interesting. Let me ask you another question. You said in 1999, that's 2 decades before Trump. Someone said, we don't have anybody at the center. We're now at the different goalposts. Who was that person, and what were they pointing at in 1999?
Well, America was already starting to be polarized at that time. So I think it's because we're in it right now. I think we forget that this was bubbling away. You know, in the 1990s, we had Clinton, we had the Republicans. You know, if we remember how hated the Democrats were by the Republicans and vice versa, you know, America felt very polarized and was very polarized in the 1990s. But now, in comparison to where we are, it feels like, oh, it wasn't that bad. But it felt bad in the 1990s because it still wasn't great. I mean, there was a lot of animosity between the two parties.
Who was that person that said that? Do you remember?
I was a grad student. I remember them coming in and doing like an intro to American politics, me being like, ooh.
Okay. So you learned this at school.
Yeah.
Intro to U.S. politics. Yeah, I just find that interesting because my research talking to different professors on political polarization has suggested it did not start with Trump. It started in the 1990s. And so I found that interesting that you were saying that. Now I try to tell other Californians that they don't really want to hear it. In their opinion, we existed in almost a perfect state of nature. And then Donald Trump came by himself and destroyed everything as a one-man wrecking ball. Yep. You don't seem to agree with that opinion, Professor.
No, I mean, if we go back to, we only have to go back and look at any of the documentaries around Clinton and the Lewinsky scandal. And you remember Ken Starr and, investigations into Whitewater. Like, it was a very adversarial Washington in 1990, the 1990s. And I think it's easy to look back with these rose-tinted glasses. But, then we had the rise of the Tea Party. Like, it was not just Trump. This country, which, when you have a two-party system, I mean, that's what's so interesting to me as obviously an outsider. This is an incredibly complex country, huge. I mean, it's like Europe plus, yet it still is a union, much to my disbelief. It still is a union. But when you have a two-party system, you're open to this kind of like this, you're in two camps. And if there was a multi-party system, if we had proportional representation, all those things, we would have less of this, I think, polarization. But it would be a big shift. But seeing how, particularly now, the government is just on the verge of shutdown at all times, I would argue we have to have a different system of government.
I totally agree. That's a conversation I've had with many professors, just for everybody, again, for everyone's education, because we're doing this to educate the lay public while not dumbing down the terminology. Most of the world's democracies have a multi-party system. And what that means is everybody votes, and however many votes that party gets, they get that equal amount of representation in their Congress, their House of Legislature. And so you'll end up with a couple different parties, 3 to 5. Most countries do this. And what happens is that they have to form a coalition government. So you get somewhere over 60% of all the people in the Congress or their government saying, we all agree, we're going to form this coalition government of these 3 parties or these 4 parties, and we're going to do X. And so you have a majority of the country moving forward. Whereas in America, what we have is, I won by 51% vote. All 49% of you can go screw yourself. And that lends itself to polarization. Is that what you're saying, Professor?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
I've heard that. And my point that I would bring up to every professor who mentioned that to me was, you realize when America invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and to turn them into democracies, we did not establish our form of democracy. We established multi-party. So even when we're going around telling other people how to make democracies, we don't even make them like our own.
Yeah.
I think that says something about a level of confidence in our system.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that needs to get discussed more is, gerrymandering, which has been a problem for a long time. But in this country now, you have very, 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 very few competitive districts.
Thank you.
You have districts that everybody knows it's a Republican district or a Democratic district. So if you need to stand above the fray in your district during the primaries, what do? You go way to the left or way to the right, which is how we've got a number now of extreme, particularly on the right, these characters who you say, how on earth did they get elected? It's like, well, in the primary, they just had to stand out against, if you're centrist in a primary, you're not going to get headlines, you're not going to get coverage, you're not going to get tweets. So the more on the end of the spectrum you are, you get more coverage, which means you're more likely to get onto the ballot, which means if you're already in a gerrymandered district, which means you've got no competition in November. So I think when we say, well, how is it that we've got more extreme politicians on the left and the right, it's because of the gerrymandering system and the primary system. So there's so many elements of the US system that have now brought us to this place where we have extreme polarization, not just in the public, but represented then in their congressional representatives.
You're talking about the vicious circle, as I've heard it described to me. I need a ton of money to win political office for any office in America I want to run. And I need to be spending 70 to 80% of my time focused on fundraising, not actually meeting the constituents, not learning the issues, getting money. And one of the things I found to do is if I can go say something crazy, boy, the TV news, Facebook, Twitter, they'll cover that. And then everyone's talking about me. And when everyone's talking about me, my donors are like, hey, I'm going to give you more money because everyone's talking about you.
Exactly.
And the news and the social media realize people love watching politicians say crazy stuff. So we should show that too. So it's this circle of worst possible behavior encourages worst possible behavior, encourages worst possible behavior. Let me ask you, I'm guessing you were originally from England?
I am, yes.
Okay. I went to London after 9/11. It was beautiful. The English people were awesome and very welcoming. And for anybody, if you ever get the chance to go to London, don't take a tour. Go on the street, go to a local pub, and order Guinness. Sit there with the Guinness. No, not anymore.
That's an Irish beer. You need to order.
I know, but when we were in London, everybody loved that we were drinking Guinness and not Bud. They go, "Oh, you're not a Yank." I don't know. Find out. Okay, find out the local beer. Do not drink American beer. Do not even look at American beer.
Yeah, do not order Budweiser. You're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, because they're already checking you. So don't even glance at it. Find the local beer. Go to pub. Order a beer. Try to start up conversations. We found people were incredibly friendly and open to talk and have a good time in the pub. My brother chatted up this one guy and he bought us all like a round of drinks and food. And I was like, how did you do this? He goes, I don't know. I just kind of talked and was up. So British people were wonderful. Don't take a tour. Go to the pubs. Go pub hopping. See the actual streets of London. Meet the actual London people. And then if you want, go see the palace. It's beautiful, etc. That's my opinion. So I needed to get that in. Claire, America super polarized, but polarization is not just happening in America. We've heard about polarization in Poland, in Hungary, and in jolly old England across the pond, I think, right? There was a thing called Brexit, and it seemed to be very polarizing for the English people. And yet you don't have a two-party system or Donald Trump. How did the English people experience high levels of polarization when you don't have our bifurcated election system?
Well, it's interesting. We have a first past the post system. And whilst we technically have not just a two-party system, we primarily have the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. So most British people, we have the Green Party, we have the Liberal Democrats, but they're very low in number. And we don't have proportional representation. So we have constituencies and we have very small ones. So sometimes the votes can be like 100 between different candidates. And in that situation, it's very, very rare that because it's first past the post, that any of those smaller parties would win. So we don't really have a proportional representation system. So I think the question of like, why is polarization increasing everywhere is we have to recognize that for many, many people, the world really does feel like it's turned upside down. Like for many, many people, there's serious economic insecurity. It's less likely than ever before that they will own a house like their parents did. It's less likely that they will have job security. It's less likely that they will have a pension. Technology is changing at the speed of light. Climate change for many people is a real worry. So in that context, people are increasingly scared and they're frightened. And when people as humans are in that space, we are desperately seeking answers because it's hard to sit in an ambiguous state, right? So it's hard to be told, this is confusing. We're really not sure what's going to happen. It's much easier to be told, here's the answer. And if you support this person, they will solve these problems for you. Because we're talking about polarization, but we've also got to say that in many of the countries that you named, there is a strong leader or there is a very strong competition. So in Brazil, Bolsonaro, in Hungary, Orban, like we can't, you know, to be fair, in the UK for a while there we had Boris. You know, there is a person who is saying, I can fix these concerns. I am the leader who can fix these concerns. So you have these kind of strong leaders on the right, and then on the left you have this kind of like you have this kind of response to that, which tends to be like moving people further to the left. Like, oh my God, this is so terrible. The answer is for us to be the extreme opposite. So what we're losing is the kind of centrist, okay, you feel slightly differently to me, but we're not that far away from each other. Let's talk to each other. Instead, it's the Brexit. Oh my God, we've got to drag the whole country out of Europe. I'm like, oh my God, we've got to put everything back in. Like, we've just lost any nuance, and everybody's just in this pendulum. But like I said, we've got to blame systems. Like your point about electoral systems are an important one, but the society and what's happening to people and the insecurities they're feeling is driving people to look for certainty. And you end up feeling more certain when you're in the extremes, even though that's not the reality, but you feel, oh, I'm over here with the people who really believe that if none of us get vaccinated, we'll be okay. Or I'm over here who believe all we have to do is get back into Europe and then everything will be solved. So that's kind of why we're on this like roller coaster path, because we're living in a very uncertain world. The world feels much, much, much more uncertain than it did in the mid-90s. The mid-90s was, what was the stain on the blue dress? I mean, that really was the only thing we had to care about. Whereas today, there's a whole host of things that are significantly more important than that conversation. So I think it's hard, again, to forget that in 20 years, the world has become a lot more worrying, insecure, complex, scary. And in that space, polarization has allowed people to feel more certain.
I'm not going to explain that reference, but that was very funny. If we could somehow get back to the unipolar moment where America seemed to run the whole planet and the Soviet Union was off and the internet wasn't super powerful, it was just kind of like a fun thing with America, AOL, we could massively reduce political polarization. I mean, if we could make the world more orderly, would that reduce this desire amongst people to seek out these solid answers in a chaotic world? If we somehow reduce the perceived chaoticness of that world?
I mean,
I know that's an existential question.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to, I mean, there's many responses, right? There's no silver bullet. And I think, you know, things like changing political system, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of this is, you know, the need to strengthen the economy and to shorten the economic disparity, right? Like the world cannot continue when there is so much wealth held in such a small number of hands. And so many people feel, you know, I teach students and they are very privileged students, but, you know, for many of them, they really are very concerned about leaving with a job that's going to allow them to pay their loans, that allows them to, they know they can't buy a house, but they just want enough to, like, you know, even, I'm in Providence, the rent here is skyrocketing. So when we say what's it going to take, it's a mixture of giving people more security about their economic future, but it's also bringing back the ties that connect people to one another. So we know there's an epidemic of loneliness globally. Loneliness drives more people online, drives them to the extremes, drives them to like, I want to feel something. Like if we know this, like fewer people are going to church, fewer people are getting married, fewer people are having children, you know, fewer people know their neighbors. In those spaces, then these politicians and these parties fill the gap. And you don't know your neighbors, so you don't recognize that actually you're very similar. And, you know, so I would argue there's some of that, those social ties are important too. So, you know, economic security, societal security, that you feel connected to people and you're not going to die alone. Like all of those things, I would argue, are part and parcel of this. Get less talked about because they're not quick fixes. But all of that, the fabric of the country, of society, is really driving a lot of these trends around polarization.
Could you say more about the last part you said? These aren't quick fixes, so maybe they're not as talked about. What did you mean by that, Professor?
I mean, if you want to write a headline for a newspaper, nobody wants to be like, this is a really hard problem. It's going to take multiple decades. and it's going to require us to, do important work in many different. Nobody picks up the paper to read that, right? So if I'm a funder and I'm at like the Ford Foundation or the MacArthur Foundation, I want something that I can go back to my board in 2 years' time to say, I gave money to these 5 nonprofits and they did this, and as a result, this happened. Like, everybody wants solutions that they can see. Philanthropists and donors want quick fixes. Governments want quick fixes because they want to get elected, and they've probably got a 5-year or 4-year gap before they're up for election again. Like, the system is set up for quick fixes because that's where the rewards lie. So to say this is going to be a complex, long problem with, we've just got to try different things. Nobody wants to hear that. The multi-generational problems are not sexy. They don't have a payback quickly. So, something like homelessness, we are still struggling with homelessness because nobody wants to really invest long-term around a problem like this. And so it just keeps getting worse. But that's because we need to do multiple things to change that problem.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Okay, we are winding down. You have been awesome. You have been insightful. I really appreciate you adding some backup information to some of the stuff we had already heard and being willing to take some existential questions. Last 2 questions. You can't tell anybody, okay? But this is actually a magic wand. I know it looks like a regular pen, but it is a magic wand. It has the power of Thanos' ring from the Marvel movies. You go poof, and the world changes. You can have 200 million people think the way that you want. You could have the Constitution pass amendments. You could have all politicians start saying the things you think you need. You have this power. It's in your hands. What 3 things could you do with the power of God that would instantly fix polarization in America?
Great question. The one thing is that I would decrease wealth inequality.
Okay.
I don't want everybody to have the exact same amount of money, but I do not want Jeff Bezos to have so much, and I don't want the person next door to me to have so little. That I think would change a number of these things. I would get rid of gerrymandering. I would ensure that every single district was really had a chance on both sides. It really was representative of people from both parties. But I would also bring in multi-party proportional representation.
That's pretty good. With those 3 things, we would definitely be a different America. Definitely. Those 3 right off the bat. Whether that means it's 100% fixed, I don't know, but that would definitely be a gigantic step in the right direction if we did those 3 things. Okay, last question. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this interview, and they said, wow, I learned a lot. That professor was so smart. I learned so much, but I'm not familiar with the topic, so I'm struggling to remember everything she said, even though I found it was great. But it's 5 days after I finished watching that interview. And while I struggle to remember everything they talked about, there was this one thing the professor said. And it's 5 days after the interview, and I can't get that one thing out of my head. Professor, what is that one thought you want a random person you'll never meet to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after watching this interview with you?
I actually think it's the loneliness part, weirdly. I think I want us to remember that so many of the problems we see on the front pages are from the fabric of society fraying, and that this isn't down to philanthropists. This is about us when we pass somebody on the street saying hello. It's about knocking on our neighbor's door when we have a heat wave to make sure that they're okay. It's about, if you haven't seen anybody, checking on them because maybe they've got COVID and they need some soup. I know that sounds kind of twee, but I think we talk a lot about the big stuff. And I think if we actually got back to knowing one another and talking to one another, as opposed to shouting across each other, we wouldn't be where we are. And I once read a really good op-ed about if somebody had a magic wand, they would give everybody in America a dog, because actually when you're in a dog park, nobody asks who you vote for. You just connect over the mutual love of dogs. And so I always think about, where are those spaces that we are reminded that we're just all people? I think you can connect over children, sports, pets, faith, community. Those spaces, it doesn't matter who you vote for. It's about remembering who you are and why you love where you live and why you love each other's children. I mean, it's that stuff. And I think I wish we could talk more about that rather than the bigger picture, because I think if we got that right, we would have few of the other problems.
That's deep. That's really deep. We're going to leave it there. I want to say thank you for your time. I know you're busy. I know your time's important. Thank you for coming out. Thanks for answering all the questions. I'll send you a copy of the interview today in a couple hours. And if you have any recommendations, I'm not going to ask you now, but if you have anybody you think you might be willing to be part of an honest conversation, I'll send you a copy of the video. If you can name anybody, we'd always appreciate it. You don't have to, but we always try to keep the conversation going.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, Professor. I'll email you shortly.
Take care.
Take care.